You may have heard of some of these before, but I guarantee you haven't heard all of them. For artists of all levels, here are 77 rapid-fire tips that have genuinely changed the game for me, starting with lines and construction. Here's a breakdown of everything I've learned about sexual dimorphism, screen cap. Everything perfectly symmetrical is man-made. Think of the ribcage and the pelvis as separate entities. Don't be afraid to let them overlap. This will help add actual depth to a foreshortened pose. My method for accurate proportions is something I call connecting the dots. Before you start a drawing, try placing dots at certain landmarks such as the tear ducts, the corners of the mouth, and the nostrils, making sure to pay close attention to the distance between said dots. I recommend choosing the spots that have the least distance between them because it's easier to judge small units of space compared to larger ones. The point of this is to map out the drawing as a whole with an emphasis on the overall image instead of the individual features. This can be done with or without a reference, depending on your skill level. Some general rules about facial proportions include 1. The upper jaw cannot move. 2. The eyes are one eye apart. 3. The nostrils end at the tear ducts. 4. From the front view, the teeth leave our line of sight at the center of the eye on either side. 5. Lots of expressions require the features to squash and stretch, which is fine because that's what faces do, but keep in mind that the skull cannot relate. The most free-moving part of the face is the lips. Other than that, things generally stay in place. The lower nose can be nudged ever so slightly, and excluding the lids, good luck with shifting the eyes. 6. The septum is not very wide. My first instinct was always to make it way wider than it actually is, so here I am telling you to not do that. I know nostrils are kind of scary to draw, but they're always bigger than you think they are, unless you're drawing anime, then they don't exist. On that note, if you struggle with floating or wonky features, I recommend studying the human skull. All your reference points are much closer together, and it's a less delicate sort of balance. Faces are a lot easier to draw when you understand how they're built. If you struggle with hand-eye coordination or accurately replicating references, try drawing the subject upside down. This way, your brain can't make any assumptions of what an object is supposed to look like, and you're finally able to simply draw what you see. You can use open-world games for environment and character references. Some references of specific angles are hard to find, so either buy a mini skull or load up Wuwa. I am not joking when I say these screenshots have saved my life. For my non-gambling addicts, another great place for oddly angled references is referenceangle.com. Think of fine hair like sheets of paper and try not to stay in the second dimension. Make an effort to curl the ends towards or away from the viewer instead of to either side. This adds a surprising amount of depth to straight and wavy hair. Additionally, you can extend one line past the other at the ends for sharper points. I will not only ask this cutely, but politely as well. Please, stop neglecting your sketchbook. Digital drawing is lovely and all, but it can be difficult to swallow the extent of which you could be perfecting and polishing your work. The limitations of physical mediums helps you break through of perfectionism, only if for a moment. Here on this channel, we take art extremely seriously, but in order to make great art, you need a safe space to f around and not find out. Moreover, if you're a render maxer like me, I recommend painting with a bit of noise on top. It's subtle, but it adds a small layer of imperfection, which means other impurities won't stand out as much. Lots of sloppy attempts will always outweigh one perfect attempt. Art is about learning how to do things right the first time, not how to brute force competency out of a noob. Facing your failures will get you much farther, much faster, as long as you work diligently to correct them next time. Use cubes to help you with weird shapes at weird angles, like this son of a bitch. Sketch with permanent pens and markers. In digital terms, hard brushes. Erasers are created by and for bolder tools will do wonders for your line confidence over time. You can choose to be shy in real life, but you shan't with your art, I beg of you. On a similar note, ditch the stabilizer. It's a brilliant safety net, but it makes your lines unbelievably stiff. Inking without it will feel miserable until it doesn't. Trust. Shape variation! Never repeat the same shape or size variation of it too many times. This is that whole big, medium, small thing I'll never shut up about. Remember, anything perfectly repetitive or symmetrical is sure to feel robotic. Just as you shouldn't repeat shapes, don't excessively repeat directions either. I call this intentional randomness. This is particularly useful for free-flowing things like hair, weird Chinese gacha game belts, etc. Simplification is closer to mastery than realism is. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand understand it well enough. Style is all about breaking the rules in a believable way. For example, humans typically cannot survive the hydraulic press, but if they could, they would probably come out looking like this. The anatomical structure, for the most part, stays intact. They aren't arranged incorrectly, just warped and exaggerated. This is why people say you have to learn the rules before you break them. If your drawings feel flat and boring, change the angle and/or add some foreshortening. This can spice up the most boring of static poses. Shading everything the same way should not be considered a stylistic choice. A lot of artists, me, will learn a singular shading technique and proceed to spam it until they enter this really cute cave called carpal tunnel. This is a snooze fest. In real life, there are all sorts of different textures floating about, each one, unfortunately, requiring an alternative approach. Of course, some are more difficult to replicate than others, but hey, that's what all these brushes are for. You can and should still stylize textures, but try to approach each one of them differently. The darkest dark will always be darker than the darkest light. Contrast is created more so through the difference between light, shadow, and local value, not so much regular detail and depth shading. The typical advice is to go darker than you're comfortable with, but remember that this doesn't apply to everything. Value ranges are different across the board, but most of the time they aren't all that wide. The places drenched in shadow have their own small value range, as well as the highlighted areas. These contrast each other. If you pick the lightest value present in the shadows and the darkest value within the light, the former should always be darker than the latter. Darken and lighten layers are great for driving this point home. Sub-tip: intense lighting will obscure detail. Simplify the objects in either the light or the dark for more drama. Use the selection tool for edge control. The lasso tool is especially useful, but don't forget about her rectangular cousin. This thing is great for background elements like furniture, architecture, and the horizon. You can also use it to make perfect plus signs. A cleaner process is a shorter one. Don't be afraid to lay it on thick with the layers. Just make sure you organize them into folders so you don't give yourself a stroke later on. Pause. Art isn't just the result, it's also the process. Your speed tells you how efficient you are, and efficiency is good. 2 words: hue variation. Solid colors are another snooze fest. I want to see you swing that color wheel, babe. You can turn pictures into color palettes through a website called coolors.co. Create a new layer and fill it with solid black. Drag it above everything else and set it to saturation. Now you can flip it on and off to periodically check your values. Near the end of a painting, you can oomph your shadows and highlights with various layer modes. I go in with an airbrush on a multiply layer followed by an add or an add glow layer. You can also use color dodge if you're into that. Just keep them at a low opacity so it isn't too obvious, unless you want it to be. As for the color, either choose the one underneath the area applied or go for orange highlights and blue shadows. Personally, I just play with the hue bar until I like it. If everything is saturated, nothing is saturated. If you want anything to stand out, it has to be framed as a rarity in a sea of what is common. I encourage you to learn the more niche features of your program. Some of these can literally cut your workflow in half, the most egregious offender being CSP vector layers. I can't even remember what my life was like without them, but I'm pretty sure it was a disaster. Typically, artists consider the shadows first when presented with some ink over base tones, but I actually recommend thinking about lights instead. Not only that, but turn that shit up to 10. Standard anime lighting is fine and all, but unfortunately, I'm falling asleep. Using more direct, strong lighting can make a world of a difference, not only in the emotional impact, but between you and me, this is definitely one of those cheap tricks that make you look way more skilled than you actually are. Set big art goals at the beginning of every year and chip away at them by assigning smaller but still related goals onto each painting you make. In practice, that looks like focusing primarily on one aspect of a piece, making that one thing as phenomenal as humanly possible. And don't you dare do it from memory. Actually study and apply what you've learned. I'm watching you. The opposite side of most hard edges is a soft edge. Use the color on the opposite end of the color wheel for bounce light, especially when it comes to eyes. Complementary colors are great for making the peepers just a bit more captivating. Learning how to draw and paint backgrounds will improve everything else about your art as well. I'm so sorry. More detail is not always better. Clean, polished art is perfectly fine. That's exactly what I'm going for, but notice these long spans of empty space. Not everything has detail to be added. What I mean is, don't make up for the sake of overcomplicating things. Finished doesn't mean leaving the cookies in the oven until your house explodes. Saturated highlights and desaturated shadows, or vice versa. Fancy brushes are fun, but you don't need them. The only thing that matters is hard and soft edges. All you truly need is the airbrush and the G-pen. Do not fear simplicity. Contrary to popular belief, pure white and pure black are not cardinal sins. Do whatever you want, King. Don't be afraid of having an inconsistent art style. I can promise you your inconsistent is learning a lot more than those stagnation pills, sheep. I have a lot to say about this, but I'll just link my video about it in the card. There are actually more hues that are considered blue than any other color. This is precisely why Hatsune Miku's color palette has simply become a matter of opinion. Light penetrates transparent objects like a spear. For all the shiny things in life, you'd think it's all about the stark white highlights, but it's actually more about reflections. Apply blinding highlights with modesty. They'll even stand out more as a result. One of the most important aspects to shading skin is always the blood underneath. Any place you can sneak in some warmth, do so with confidence. Regardless of skin tone, we are all warm-blooded creatures. As a stylistic choice, I love to outline those fleshy bits in an excessively saturated red. The 3 Ds are dullness, saturation, and death. The secret 4th D is don't do that, delease. Feel free to duplicate and flip. Who said that? Pay attention to how light behaves when out touching grass. Prerequisite: touch grass. This one's pretty simple, but intentionally observing the world through a more artistic lens can actually teach you a lot, especially considering the fact that your drawing tablet has been recently diagnosed with touch deprivation. Add a saturated red and blue on either side of sharp highlights, manual chromatic aberration, and or add a dark color underneath to oomph the strength. Additionally, you can highlight the rims bordering shadows for extra emphasis. Instead of using the circle tool, just click once with the G pen. Sounds simple, but I only picked this one up recently. Spherical objects have softer edges. Anything that goes further back into space won't cut off cleanly like whatever this thing is. If you have a hard time figuring out where to place light versus shadow, visualize that you are the light source. Everything you see from that angle will be illuminated. Everything else is out of luck. Color picking for study is not illegal, I promise. Art is an illusion, not a replica. Sometimes you have to think of things differently than they actually are in real life. Ironically, they'll look worse if you're too literal with your approach. Your drawing is 90% done after the sketch. Screen cap redraws, draw this in your styles, and studies kick art block into the sun. Self-set deadlines are a miracle only if you actually adhere to them. Even if you finish late, you'll still get a lot more done in a lot less time. Make mood and reference boards for your larger pieces. It's so much easier to import one file for reference instead of having 30 unknown tabs open at once. Not only is it a time saver, but it's also inspirational depending on what you use. Mood boards like these have been a direct contributing factor to my style today. I cannot communicate to you how great these are. I talk more in depth about these in my style video, which I'll link in the card. Someone being better than you is a fantastic chance to learn something new. Healthy competition is actually a great opportunity for growth if you're able to handle it. This may be a bit contrarian, but I appreciate a good swift kick in the ass. These people will only make you stronger, even if they're 12 years old. Like the video. Subscribe. To build a unique art style, take inspiration from the visuals of non-art related things. By this I mean gloss bottles, holographic glitter, gelatin of any kind. Do you catch my drift? The possibilities are endless. If you like a particular aspect of someone else's art style, you're legally obligated to steal it. You need to take in copious amounts of art because you need to know what greatness looks like before you can operationalize it. I highly recommend checking out who your favorite artists are following on social media. I'm sure if you love their art, you'll love their inspirations just as much. Keep a running list of every creative idea you have and every little thing you'd like to implement in your work. Never rely on your memory, I promise it does not care. Easy doesn't always mean you're not trying hard enough. An output cannot exist without an input. You know what that means? Take a break. Quit death gripping your stylus! Not only is it unnecessary, but it's also gonna f those paws straight up. As pain is a universally unpleasant experience, I hereby advise the lightest grip possible. Sub-tip. Draw with your whole arm, not just your wrist. Programming and learning shortcut keys is so worth it. Please stop procrastinating it. Welcome back, Goldfish Girlies. For the funny number, I recommend excessive white noise, long podcasts, audiobooks, full albums listened to in sequential order, etc. Don't pull yourself away from your work every 2 seconds to skip 30 songs. It'll interrupt your flow state, which is similar to shredding an unspecified amount of dollar bills. Sub-tip. Buy an egg timer. This way you can track how long you're actually productive for without having to use the rectangular glass box of inevitable distraction. The definition of learning is same situation, different behavior, and working without compensation is illegal. Working a lot does not entitle you to improvement because you can easily waste an infinite amount of time working on the wrong things. Here's a video about that because a lot of you are breaking the law. Never, and I mean never, stylize out of habit. The ideas you're apprehensive about are often closest to your heart. Anything that inspires a sense of vulnerability within you should be explored and maybe even expressed. Besides, art without heart is just... For those of us who struggle to finish big projects, it's all about playing mind games with yourself. If you're able to complete it, you'll benefit from its existence for the rest of your life. Not only will you improve, but you'll also have another piece to add to your repertoire. Remember, you only have to do it once. Every time you finish anything, remember that feeling of freedom and chase it until you can bask in that golden glory all over again. I know it's terrifying, but put yourself out there. I've recently overcome some huge hurdles I've been struggling with for what feels like an eternity, and all it took was the belittlement of some asshole on the internet. Criticism is painful, yes, but after the pity party, always consider what you can learn from the experience. If you find that their comment was utterly devoid of meaning, just assume they're in love with you and move on. The inspiration to improve is an astronomically better mindset than everything I make looks like shit. I would argue that cool factor is a lot more important than proficiency. A drawing's purpose should never be a flex. Sometimes I feel like people get the wrong impression of me. I want to be the best artist on the planet, yes, but only so I can have both. Proficiency without coolness is just... And I'm predictably unsure of how to say that. Furthermore, if you're waiting to be more skilled, you're gonna be waiting forever. The problem is not that you won't improve, but that you'll never lose said ability. You can always be more skilled, and the further you get, the more you'll realize how much more there is to learn. Unlike some distant theoretical future, all those cool ideas in your head need to be actualized just as they are conceived. Accurately or not. The truth is, you'll only receive more of what you entertain. Encourage your creativity by honoring it. Have a go at it even if you know you're gonna eat I know it's frustrating to fall short of your imagination, but the only way to push past these limitations is through. You learn the most when you attempt something outside of your comfort zone, and you accomplish nothing by waiting for a day that very well may never come. When it comes to dreams, you either try or die, my friend.